Hey, Al, welcome. So we want to first kind of just name why we're gathering and why we're what we're talking about and why we're talking about it. Um, so to do that, we just to ultimately our intention is for us to join together to have this dialogue about anti-blackness within the Habesha community. Our intention is for this time to a time for us to engage in a dialogue that will hopefully lead to actions from a more conscious Habesha community. Ultimately, the goal is dialogue and then awareness. Um, Before we kind of go into like asking questions and having the dialogue, first just kind of doing a land acknowledgement. Um, so I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people past and present, and honor with gratitude land itself and the Duwamish tribe. I also want to hold a moment of silence for um, all the black folks that basically been murdered by police brutality. So we're just gonna hold a moment of silence for that.
My name is Adiam, and I use she and her pronouns, and I work at the UW Seattle in Disability Resources. And passion, that is like a long list of things. Number one, obviously, working in education is education, equity, and access. So it's really important to me. Social justice is a big passion, community engagement, but also a space of like mental health. Like, how do we take care of ourselves? How do we talk about mental health? How do we help our communities, particularly Habitat community, but I think all people of color and immigrant communities have a really hard time with mental health and talking. And so those are a lot of my passion points.
Um, my name's Ruta. Use she, her pronouns. My passion,
Yeah.
I like traveling a lot. I think it's where I spend majority of my dollars. And with that, I like access to healthcare. That's been a focus of mine. And I'm still trying to figure out a way to, I wanted to, I guess I wanted to combine the two things I like, or the three things I like, which is tech, healthcare, and then traveling. So, like, it's still something I'm working on. And by the grace of God, I hope one day I find the niche because now I have them all split up. Like my job has a little bit of both, but then my personal life has a lot of traveling, and I want to find a way to connect those niches because then I think I know there's the pursuit of happiness is endless, but I think I'll be really happy then. Even though that's not really a true statement because you can never happiness is like a journey, it's not a destination.
My name is Icalo, and I'm mostly passionate about community organizing and community engagement, usually focusing on community-based organizations. Um, I've been an activist for refugee and immigrant rights in Israel and here in Seattle.
So my name is Jonas. My pronouns are he, his, him. I am passionate about social justice. My work is ultimately about social justice, regardless of where I work, who I work with. That's what my passion is, and that's why I do the work I do. And often I'm pushing whatever I work. Nonprofits sometimes don't claim to be social justice organizations, and I'm always going to be the one speaking up and saying that if you're serving uh, marginalized communities, you're doing social justice work. You might as well call it that. So usually I'm the one speaking up and saying those things in different places where I work. With that, I'm gonna start us up with our first question, and that question is: so, given the unrest and protest against the murder of Black folks in America, the United States of America, how have you been impacted? What's been your reflection so far?
You said, have you been impacted? What was the second part?
Yeah, what? How have you been impacted, and what's been your reflection so far?
Mm. Well, I mean, I think it's been interesting because for some reason, this feels worse than all the other times. Like, this is not new, right? Like, Black bodies have been um, killed at the hands of the police for a long time. It is obviously more filmed nowadays than anything. But I think I have had a lot of anxiety, a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, a lot of stress. And my anxiety has been worse. I'm married and have a kid, because my husband like leaves to go to work, and so there's been some anxiety about like him being a black man. And I think even in the space of like being Eritrean and talking about like how we don't always see race the same way, especially if you're a more recent, person who's come from Eritrea to here. And so we have conversations all the time about race, and he's like, "I'll be fine," like I'm Eritrean, like whatever. It's like, do you see yourself as black or do you not? And so but then the fear is like me, right? Like, is he going to come back, and what's going to happen, and how do we handle that? So I think it's been, even though since we've been together, there's been other black deaths, that for some reason this just feels worse and feels more intense. My reflection is just kind of like, is it because it's more in the media? Is there some space because of COVID and like we're all at home, and so you have nothing else to do but watch it and pay attention, which is probably why the protest and the movement is a lot stronger right now. But also, right, that the pandemic already causes a sense of stress and anxiety. So then do you add more stress and anxiety because now you're thinking about, but I think as a Black person in America, you're always thinking about race. Like that doesn't go away, but all of that kind of combined has been a little bit harder to deal with. And then having no sense of probably like a real routine because of COVID, you're like at home. And so that feels like you don't have an escape mentally. When we were going to our offices and like going out and doing stuff and traveling, like you said, you can escape the reality a little bit, and you don't get to escape it anymore. So, and then I think another reflection for me has been around how do you have a conversation with a 6-year-old around like race and protests and racism. And we've tried to have that conversation since, for the last couple of years anyway, but it's really different conversation now that she has a different cognitive ability at 6. Like, right, 3 and 4, you have to talk about it differently. At 6, they get it. They start to pay attention to those things. And so that's been a lot harder because now I have to put way more energy in like talking to her and talking to my husband, to my in-laws, and then talking about it at work all the time, even though we're online. Everybody wants to talk about it. And so you kind of have to then also as a Black person carry this burden of how do you talk about it. So from my own personal experience, is it the social justice realm? Like there's a lot of different emotions when you have to be and a lot of times the only Black person in your office, and like everyone wants to talk about it. Everyone expects you to be this expert. And then being Eritrean, you have this weird world of like, I'm not actually, right, in the same way an expert in those kind of life experiences exactly the same as our kind of fellow Black Americans. And so that's been my reflections recently.
Absolutely. I want to actually, I've been curious about why now, right? Like, why is there so much, the way you just said, why is there like a lot of attention, even though there's been these murders happening over and over prior to right now? And I'm still trying to figure it out, but I think one thing I've been reflecting on is like, I think there's a greater level of urgency from not just from Black people, but also like allies. People have been like speaking to their communities and speaking to each other and their families, and they're also speaking up in the media. And like politicians are paying attention, right? When there's like an array of people speaking up, politicians are most likely going to pay attention. And then at the same time, I think the cases are, I don't know, I mean, I don't have the knowledge of all the cases, but the cases, I think, case of Ahmaud Arbery and like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor are definitely like cases where you can clearly see they like did nothing to deserve to like to get like there were no you can't point out anything really to say like, oh, maybe they should have put their hands on the wheels, right? Maybe they should have like, no, like this person had
Was sleeping. Yeah.
sleeping, and like they just came in and shot her and killed her. Like Ahmaud Arbery was like checking out a place that was like being newly built, just like everybody else, and happened to be walking by and running by. Like, and you see George Floyd like out loud crying, he can't breathe, calling for his mom, and nobody responding, and 4 cops standing around and not doing anything and not responding to that at all. Like you can hear it, like you don't have to be so close to it even. And so I think there's like some outrage a little bit more from like even non-Black folks to be like, wait, they really don't value Black lives. Like if they did, like they would pay attention. They would remember that they're humans. They would remember that George Floyd is a person who's like screaming and near death. Like they would have responded to it if they remembered, just like them, that he's also another human being. So that's something I've been reflecting a lot about, and I think part of it also, in America, white folks have power, and like if a lot of white folks are speaking up, people will pay attention. People in power will pay attention, who are also mostly white folks. And so I think like this movement, I've been reflecting a lot how this movement is stronger because of the allyship that's existing. That's like people are seeing that's a very multicultural movement in many ways, and that's something I think will help keep the momentum of the movement.
So the one thing that I learned during these protests and unrest is that I always knew that I did not understand all. I mean, I didn't. I knew. I always knew that I need to learn more. But this time, it was actually a shock for me, like that I did not know even a little of the mantra of the problem. So I'm trying to learn more. I'm trying to dig like stories and the layers, the layers of the problem, the racism problem, and all the systematic racism. Um, but at the same time, I have this dilemma of, I'm new to the country, so I'm learning, but I have a dilemma as if like to prioritize, like do I want to know? And the more I know, the more I learn, the more I feel like guilt. And so it's kind of a dilemma. Do I want to know more and feel guilt, or should I just be ignorant? Should I choose to be ignorant and feel okay by myself? So I've been struggling with this kind of thoughts. Obviously, I chose to learn, so I'm trying. I'm reading more. I'm learning more. And I went to that was my first day actually. I went to the Habesha rally last Sunday, and it was my first day to the protest, and it was beautiful. It was more than I thought. It was more than I expected. And
No, I wanted to ask you, what do you mean by guilty? I wanted to get more into that. What do you mean by that?
well, I think the fact that I'm living on a land, and a stolen land, and that I mean, it's also generally like my personality, I but clearly it's because I feel like I'm living on a stolen land, and like on a history of, or somebody fought for centuries, like, or for decades, and I'm here, and I'm
Benefiting from it.
enjoying that. I'm benefiting from those, from the land, and from the
The
fight
people.
somebody fought before me. So I feel like, and the fact that I am not taking, or I'm not fighting, or I have this kind of a sense of like, it's not my fight. It's not always like that.
Okay, thank you.
And I think
For
that's like a super common reaction of like Eritrean people, right? Is like it's not my fight. And I've been seeing lots of posts of like, hey, Eritrean, Ethiopian, whatever, right? Immigrant kind of Africans. You wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the fight and the struggle of kind of the Black American, right? And everything that they went through. Like we wouldn't have been able to come to America, at least as free people, right? If slavery and civil rights and all of those things didn't happen. So I think there is a privilege when you do come from a country that you know the history of, because you pay attention to that country's history more, that you don't have to pay attention to kind of the full context, right, of the story of Black Americans. And so you can get away with that, right? There's like a privilege in being a more recent kind of immigrant African than our Black brothers and sisters are.
I feel you guys on that too. Like, but with me, like I had been here like since I was a lot younger, and for a long time it was always been I'm rich, I'm very proud of it. And there was a point of my life where it was like, are you Eritrean or are you Black? And it would be, my African American friends would definitely be like, oh, you're definitely Eritrean, But then I always felt, for all intents and purposes, I am Black. And then in my private life, I'm Eritrean. And no one really understood that. And everyone's like, what? And I'm just like, I'm Black. Like, what you mean? But and the people used to think when I said that is to derail from me being Eritrean, to take away from it. There's no pride in it or something. And I'm like, yo, I was on the freaking African Association of UW. I was on the freaking board. I did all these things like to showcase my culture all the time, you know? But it's like, but they couldn't really, maybe it's because as young people or society, whatever, or maybe the people I was around, we weren't, I guess we didn't have the tools and the education to understand that. And so I just, yeah, I just felt like it was just, I didn't have an identity crisis, but everybody felt like I did. And there was this narrative pushed on me like, no, but you're this, but you're that. And I would always be like, okay, whatever, you know? But now we're getting to the, I think to the, we're moving forward in a really cool way where you can be Black and you can still be, celebrate your culture. So, and I'm happy that we're moving that direction.
We've touched a bit of the next question. So I think we all agree that there is there's some kind of anti-blackness in whether it's there is some kind of anti-blackness in the Habesha community. So what are some of the ways, like it could be conversations, it could be like thought processes in which the anti-blackness manifests itself?
We're about to call people out.
We're diving
Okay.
in.
Hey, you don't have to say their name. Don't say their name.
No, I'm
Go
talking
ahead.
about like, by people I
Diving in.
meant our community.
Oh, yeah, but it's real.
The
It's real, right?
anti-blackness. I know, but it's like so many things we have to unlearn
Yep.
that they don't even realize it's anti-blackness. And I try to tell this to my parents all the time. And my mom was like, you know, you're right. That is really wrong. And so for me, I guess my first thing that stands out to me, and sorry, I just hijacked that, was in our vocabulary, right? We use vocabulary that are really, really anti-Black, and we don't even realize it. Like when we say baria, like, you know, to somebody, that literally translates to slave, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you say that to somebody, it's usually when you're referring to somebody that's like dark-skinned. And we say it and we don't realize like that's wild. And when we say like somebody's like ugly, we use synonyms that are dark, right? Or خمزي مثل like oh my gosh, I don't want to say that. They're just, I'm like, don't say them. So to me, but I hear all the time. Or I hear what are the other words I'm trying to say? I'm even debating if it's like appropriate to say, but like they just say so many words that are so like to describe anything negative is a synonym for Black, you know? And that's, I think, a everyday way we practice anti-Blackness within our household, and we don't even realize it, you know? And even when we describe something beautiful, we're like, oh, yeah, you know? And then, oh no, is that a and it's like very like, wow, like simply like it's telling me she's dark skin equals she's not beautiful. She's light skin equals beautiful. In the same way we say, like when I come from vacation, my mom was always shocked, like, because I'm always on the beach, I'm always doing crazy stuff. So she's always like, why do you look like this? You're supposed to come back like all light and like, you know, vacation. You're supposed to come back better and happier and whatever. But it's like the words they use is like, but you look darker. You look like this. You don't look like you came from vacation, you know? And it's like we associate a lot of darkness with negativity and whiteness with positivity. And that's one way I've experienced anti-Blackness within my community. Anyway.
Yeah, there was this girl that posted I think it was on Instagram or something, and she was like, when we say like Hamad, like they look like Hamad.
Yeah.
Even. Like we're always, it's always brown. Related to something. Yeah, like the color. She's like all the other colors are like just related to the color, right? Like is just right? But it's like then when you say brown, Hamad. Like it's Hamad, it's like literally like mud and dirt. Like why does it have to be like a bad thing? So even like just as simple as like the way we've named colors, like they picked, you know, that's what they picked, which obviously is like the color of dirt or whatever it is, but like that's the description. But I think even when sometimes our community or our parents like will say like, oh, that Black person is like they're talking about people who are not Eritrean or Ethiopian or even more recent like kind of immigrants, right, like descendants of slaves. And so they're always like, oh, those Black people are different from us. There's always this distinction. And so I think that's another way we perpetuate anti-blackness. Our culture is always, and so I think even to your point of like, oh, you're black, that like, yeah, if I was say I'm black, my parents would be like, what are you talking about? Like, you're not black, you're Eritrean. I'm like, no, we're also black. Like, you can be both, and it took a while, I think, even for my parents to understand, like, you're both, right? Or if something was like Black Lives Matter, I might have like, why would you say that? You're not black. It's not about you. I'm like, it is about you. It's about me. Like, and their just
Yeah.
understanding of it is like that there is a separation, right?
Right.
That doesn't have to do with just because like our families came here more recently, right? Like there's just like, oh, they're different people, and it's like, no, you're not. Like it's the same thing. They've just been here longer than you, and that's not the definition when our families are talking about kind of right like the black people that are different from us. So I think that's another way we kind of perpetuate anti-blackness. Obviously, even kind of like those then values that they put on, right? Like, oh, how successful or how important or how good of a job or how educated, right? We know the issues, the systemic issues in America that cause that, but they separate our people from that list, right? As opposed to like, it's a problem that impacts all of us. It's like, oh, they have all these issues that have made it harder for them. It's like, we have the same issues, but they don't see us in that same kind of pile. I mean, there are different issues our families and like, right, have to deal with. Immigration is a very different issue for our families to deal with than, kind of people who've been here for longer generations as Black people. So there's also that. But I mean, I think that just that general even thought process of Eritreans in America, that there's such a big difference between the two of us that we are not in the same grouping. Which part of, like you said, is how do we teach that, right? For that, in the sense of my parents, they were the first, right, generation of being here. They were raising kids brand new. It was all new to them. It made no sense whatsoever. But now as they're talking to their grandkids, like they have language or they have different ways to understand, even if they fully don't get it and they still, right, perpetuate anti-Blackness, they have a better understanding. But when they were first here, like who was going to teach them, right? Like how are they going to have that dialogue and discussion? And they didn't hang out with Black people, but they didn't hang out with anybody. They only hang out with other Eritreans, right? Like it's not like because it was like a separation of Black people and them, it was everybody else except for other Eritrean people or other immigrants or refugees who were in similar programs. I remember growing up in Arizona, all of the other refugees, because there were not that many Eritreans there, were Asian, but it was the like refugee Asians that my parents talked to, not like any Asian person they saw, because they were going through a process and a system together. And getting help from each other in that same way, right? So it was also like they had no avenue to figure out how to find that information. And now we have technology and TV. There's just more information at hand, but they've also been here long enough and exposed to more people. And then with their kids, that hopefully they're learning, even if they're still kind of doing that, like you said, about you can explain something to them now and they will understand it. Where I think if somebody had tried to explain any of that to my parents in the 80s, that would not have been the same process as right now.
Right. I agree with you.
Yeah, I think both of you, Adiam and Ruta, covered a lot of different things that I was like, oh, this is this and this is that and this is this. As y'all speaking, is like you see ways in which like white supremacy culture affects us as well, right? There's elevation of whiteness as of like as the standard.
Right. And colonialism, right?
Yeah, totally. And given our
Part.
history of like immigrating here from an African nation and living here, definitely like we have the colonial like impact of in our culture and the ways we view beauty, and the ways we view each other, the ways in which we elevate whiteness, and and I wonder, like, right, this is like I wonder if we were to be more aware that we're actually elevating whiteness, we're putting like white folks, white skin on a pedestal, right? We're saying they're superior, they're more intelligent, they are more capable, they're prettier, they're smarter, they're more handsome. I wonder if we were to frame it that way for our people, that we're like doing that actively by doing the things that you just described, Rutan Adam, like by saying somebody who's darker is not as pretty or as lighter. Being lighter means like more rested, and being lighter means that you're like going to get something and whatever, just some positive juju, whatever it is, right? It's like that we but you don't in the reality, right? And I think like I wonder, like this is maybe a question for all of us to consider. Is like I wonder if we were to start to frame this conversation in that way for our folks, that people would start to check, to be like, obviously most of our people don't believe that white people are superior. Maybe true, maybe not. Maybe some of us do.
I was gonna say, I
Consciously,
actually don't think that's
subconsciously.
true. I actually think that some of our like, at least I think of some of the parents, my parents' generation that I talked to, especially when I went back home, even there's a much better, like, higher regard for white people than even themselves, right? Or even, and the
Mhm.
same thing, like, oh, this Italian person is prettier, even though we got all kinds of history with Italian people. We don't like that kind of country as a whole, right? They would still be like, this Italian person is like better, prettier. You can like, even I remember back in the day, like, I can't remember who I was talking to back home. I went back home and it was like, oh, you have to marry an Eritrean, right? It was like this whole conversation, like, you have no option. And then it was like this hierarchy of who else you can marry. And like white people were above like Black Americans, right? So even in that anti-blackness, but at that moment, I was like, hey, that's racist. You shouldn't say that. So I was like, let's have a conversation with my 13-year-old self fighting with this like old Eritrean man, which was probably not helpful. But was in thinking like he really thinks these white people are better than like all of us, right? Even and that it really was like in him and embedded in that same. That's why I brought up colonialism, is even just like it really is, I think, a standard of like whiteness and Europeanness as the standard, and there is
Yeah.
some internalized oppression in that, right? Like in thinking that's better than even me and us. And I like he was like okay with the fact if I married a European person or a white person, but like anything else was not okay. And I was just like, how does that even make sense that you are coming up with this is okay? And a lot of people that were in the room were like not opposed to his thought process, right? So I do
Mhm.
think there's some internalized racism, colonialism, whatever it is for even our people, where we really do think white is the epitome, which is taught and trained, and we're socialized too. But
Mhm.
I
No.
don't know if you told
Yeah.
it to them, Jonas, if as many of them would actually care. Maybe our generation, right? But what would care?
I
I don't
mean,
know. That's my
white
opinion.
supremacy is strong. No, I've always said like we don't give enough we don't give white supremacy enough credit. Like these mofos have gone deep, 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 deep. Like I'm talking about like internationally, everywhere I've gone, you guys. I like y'all know for what I do in my free time is I catch a flight and just go somewhere, explore a country, and I see white supremacy in every single country I've been to, and I've been to all the continents except Antarctica, and I've seen it, and I've seen places where I was celebrated for my color because they thought I was resilient. That wow, I'm so strong to even be here, to be allowed in this space. How did I even make it? You have a passport, you have a U.S. passport. It's like what? And I've seen other places where they, how dare I be here? How dare I have this access? And these have come from countries that are black. These have come countries from Asia. These have come from countries that are white. And I've been in in Asian countries where the white person felt like they belong there more than the local people and they belong there more than me. And they've told me I needed to leave and to go back to where I am from. And I was like, we are literally in Bali. I'm not from here. I'm not Indonesian. You're not Indonesian. But yet you felt like so strong in your whiteness that you can say that to me. Do you know what I mean? So white supremacy is really huge, and it is, and colonization is deep as hell, and it's in all of us, and our parents have created through. And I think the way they're so anti-black is because I think white supremacy has really won, right? They've taught us black people are lazy, black people are this, black people are that. All these negative attributes are given to black people versus all these positive attributes are given to white people. Even when I go to restaurants, you guys, I'll be in restaurants in random places trying to support my people. I'm like, oh, I see a new Richmond restaurant in Chicago or in DC. Let me go in there. And I seen waiting, and me and my friends are just by myself waiting, and white people and Asians being sat before me, and I was supposed to be understanding and supposed to be like get it. Like no, Han, they're just waiting. You guys, and I was like after this happened, I've literally have pulled a manager aside, and thankfully my chicken is good enough where I could really give it to her. And I was like, what you're doing is not right. And she's like, I was like, no, 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 you expect me to understand you. Funny thing is you should be honoring me and treat me better because I am yours. I'm supposed to be that. And I walked into the restaurant and chose this establishment because I consider you as one of mine, and I wanted to give my dollars to your business and your establishment. But you don't value my money as much as you value these other people's. And she was like, oh my, she was scared. I knew she was like, how did we get this deep? But I was like, no, this happens across the country, even in Europe, when I was in Europe. And I was like, I love our people because in our homes, we honor the hell out of one another. It's so dope, especially Gasha. we almost do too much. Honestly, we need to work on that. It's so tiring to Habesha. Oh my god. It's like, can y'all just have tea and sit
All the
down?
moms just freaked out if you are if they're listening to
I
it.
know. They're like, why? Sometimes they be like, but yeah, Gasha is too much. But I love that we do that, right? It's this thing we do for guests and it's beautiful. But it's like, why is that outside of our homes we honor and celebrate other groups, particularly white groups, before us? And with this anti-blackness, it's just like with this NMT, we're always like, oh, they're this, they're that, they're this, or that. Like, I always make a joke to anyone that I date that's African American. If my dad had a gun, if he was like a white crazy man, he would have a gun and probably shoot you. And then a lot of them would think it's because they're not Eritreans, right? And or they'll say like, oh, they're because I'm. Oh no, they'll say it's because I'm black, and it's sad too because they're like, but you're black, and I'm like, I know, but to them I'm not black, and it's like this weird thing to explain. And then I'm like, how do I explain to these people that I'm dating that I do care about, like about this anti-blackness that I have within my own community, you know? And some will dead ass be lighter than me. They're like, what the? I know, but to my mom and dad, you black and he black. I'm Eritrean. We're different.
Like with anti-blackness, I'm curious to ask, like, those moments where you've experienced anti-blackness, like, how did you react to it?
Oh
And
God.
like looking back, would you have liked to react it differently?
From our community you're talking about, or just like
Yeah,
anybody?
within the Habesha community.
Oh, man, that's this. Now we will get real painful and real deep. So the one and only time I've been back home, I was 13, and I came here when I was like 2, so I was pretty Americanized even still then. But I remember we went back home, and there was this group of, I mean, like American kids who were across the street. Could very much tell they were not Eritrean. Some of them were not even black. There was like a mixed group, and I don't know if they were there for a trip or what happened. But I remember it was like my saddest moment of being in Erda. And my aunt, we were walking on one side of the street and they were on the other side, and they were being loud and they were just kind of walking downtown. And one of them had a mohawk. It was like straight up like red. It was super colored. And she was like, "Oh, there's your people." Like, I'm the kitty. And I was like, "What?" She was like, "I'm the kitty." I was like, "Why?" She's like, "Those are your people. Like, that's your crew. Like, go over there." Like, I was like American, right? I was like all like just like them and not Eritrean. And at the time I was like, oh, she's associating me because I like my Tiffany's not that good. I like grew up in America or whatever. But most of the people in the group were black. There was a couple people that weren't. But and she was like, no, because like that's you're more like them than you are us, right? And so there was this like moment that was like, but you don't even know these people. Like they could be like rich and famous and doctors and like saving the world, or like who knows what they are and what they're doing. And she like already had decided we were different and we were separate and like right between the two, and then that I didn't fit in, right, even in the Eritrean community, but also that like I belonged over there. And you know, we were walking or something, and I was probably like way too young to be fighting with my aunt at the time. Now I know better, I definitely would be fighting with her. But it was like, how do I have this conversation about like, you know, I don't know why you think there's a difference. Like we're literally just across the street. That's the only difference between us right now, right? Like we're all people, and they just like may live in a different country or have a different life than you, of course. But I'm not sure like what, you know, what is so important to like distinguish in that way, right? So, but it was definitely like I wasn't good enough to be right Eritrean because I was just like black people. And I, you know, at the time, I don't think I was as vocal in terms of social justice at the time, but like I didn't mind being like, I didn't think it was a bad thing to be called black. But I think that was like my first kind of memory and moment of realizing like there was this separation, because my, you know, my dad is very traditional and very like educating about Eritrean history and culture and like the war. So he would always teach us that. So it was never like, oh, you're better necessarily, or like, you know, if he knew nothing else about anybody else except Eritreans to talk about Eritreans. So that's all we talked about. But that was like this first moment where I like was like, wow, our people are kind of mean and really like vocal about it. And I think part of being sheltered was also like there weren't as many Eritreans growing up in Phoenix, and so there wasn't that many of us. Now there's way more. When you're in a bigger group, right, you're around people more often. So we weren't really around as many people, but I think that was like a first kind of moment. And then as there were more Eritreans, or we would go to more events, or I would say things, or I'm a super activist and I'm really loud about stuff. And so, you know, I think then even family members who would say stuff, or, you know, kind of this like, oh, Adam cares about black people more than Eritrean people. And I'm like, that's not true. Those are the same thing anyway. But, and so, you know, there's lots of ways you could probably deal with that. I don't think I've always dealt with it well. I yell at people, but I think there's a space in like, how can I educate, right? And I think I got smart enough to realize, are you worth educating? Like, are you worth the time and energy? Because you're actually going to listen to me. And there's, to your point with that, like, how do you teach them about what's ingrained in them? So I'm like, okay, let me explain to you why you might think this, or what you might believe about this group of people. When you actually, like, how many Black friends do you have? Like, like my aunt, if I was to go back, I'd ask my aunt, like, how many Black people do you know that you've actually spoken to and that you've had dialogue with, right? Versus believing stereotypes. And especially here in America, I'm like, you would be clumped in that same group, right? And so if the police saw you, they're not going to see you that you're air trained, they're going to see that you're Black, and it's the same thing. And so how would you want to be seen, and how would you want people to perceive you in that space? But when you have no experience with Black people, and everything is from TV and movies, and I remember that same trip to Air Trip, my cousins, every Friday night, one movie would play in Air Trip, and it was an English movie. And I was like, we were so excited. We're like, oh, we watched the same movies. And we sat down, and the movie that was on TV was Don't Be a Menace to South Central while drinking your juice in the hood. And I was so mad because I was like, let me explain to you that this, and then I was like, okay, this is a random funny day. Like, what are other movies? And there's like Western and all these other kinds of movies. But the only movies about Black people or culture were all of kind of like the hood movies, right? And I was really upset because I'm like, oh, like media is doing this too, number one. But number two, like, how do you teach yourself that that's a problem? So I think even addressing people here to say, like, okay, it might not be your fault because you didn't realize like all of the messaging and images you saw and the stereotypes you have of Black people, but none of it is based on true fact or people you've actually engaged with. So how about make some friends and engage with those people, and then we could talk. And I have lots of friends who are, quote unquote Black and not Eritrean in your mind, and I can tell you what those people do and what kind of people they are, and they're exactly like Eritrean people. We got good people, we got bad people, we got foolish people, we got people who need help, right? We all have all of that in all of our communities, and there's no
absolutely. No, my dad, what he's like, like, what's the problem? You go in. He's like, what? Like, are you like, what is this love you have? Imagine. I'm just like, and I sometimes I have to be harsh about it the way I explain it. I feel like, imagine my little brother name is Daniel. He just graduated college about a little less than a year ago, and so he's like their little baby, right? He's the baby of the house, and I'm always like, imagine Daniel, this good, sweet kid you raised, who's so awesome, is driving and he gets stopped for a traffic stop, and then he's dead. They were like, "Best mom, could you say that?" I was like, imagine. And Daniel, to us, he's perfect. He's a good kid. He's sweet. He's nice. He's listened his whole life. He's on the book. He's amazing, right? And now the news is gonna show him as like the one time Daniel got a ticket. That's what we're gonna share. Not the graduation pictures, not him being on the basketball team of his college, not all these great attributes about him. They're gonna be like, oh yeah, in 2000 whatever, when Daniel was like a child, the first time he got a license, had got a ticket. That's what they're gonna share, and then they're gonna like justify his death. But to you, that's your baby that you've raised your whole life. And then another scenario, who, if you had a kid who didn't go to college, who might have made a few mistakes, still your baby, still a great human, still deserves to live, gets stopped for a traffic stop, and then dies. And my mom was like, what? What? Why would you say that? She was just like shocked. And I had to be brutal. I was like, that's how it is out here. Black moms are, every day, mom, Black moms are crying and screaming because their kids are being murdered for no reason all the time. And she was just like, I know, the Aduka, they're like this, I get it. But I literally, it got to the point where I had to make it personal for them to really get it. Because they're thinking this would never happen to us because we're law-abiding citizens. We're great. We're sinister atalana. We're not, like, it's always like, we're not like, I'm like, first of all, I'm definitely dege. I be kicking it. Like, what are you talking about? I'm like, whoa. You know what I mean? I hang out. I have friends. I socialize. I travel. I socialize. You know what I mean? So I was just like, you don't have to be a model minority. Like, you could be a model minority and you will still get killed, And with my parents, I think they're finally starting to get it. And like my mom's always been sympathetic. I think she always understood like the powerness of whiteness in this country. But with my dad, he's so like Eritrea focused. His only issue is just Eritrea. How can we better Eritrea? Eritrea this. And I'm kind of like, had to tell him, like, you live in a country where it's not Eritrea. And your kids are raised in not Eritrea. Your grandkids are being raised in not Eritrea. So you have to care about the problems in this country too. Like just as much. And I think to him, he used to see it as like, it means he cares less about Eritrea if he starts caring about the problems in this country, But I'm like, no, it doesn't mean that. It just means that you care about the rights of Black people, which are us. And the whole thing. I'm not. I was like, okay, it's just each battle each day. And I definitely haven't been great. There's times where I've said really strong words, like calling them racist, really loud, very angry. And I think it was like my logic left me and I was just emotional about it. And I would just like, you guys are no better than white people. The way you guys operate or the things you guys are saying, and to them, it's because they're well intended, and so they don't realize they're being what they're saying is crazy. And I try to make them understand there's intention and there's impact. Like your intentions could be really well, but your impact could be really devastating. And so there's real impact to what you're saying, because this conversation you're having, I'm sure you're having with all your friends, all the rest of the community. And I always try to educate them on the fact that Black people are always judged on a group basis, while white people are judged individually, right? So when a Black person does something bad, it's like, oh, all Black people do this. When a white person does something bad, oh, he has mental health issues. He's an individual who's just had a rough road, and we got to get him to the right side, and with the right care, he'll be all right. So I was like, you see the narrative they built for Black folks versus white folks? It's like one is uplifting, the other one is just diminishing. And I was like, and when they say that narrative about Black folks that's so negative, I'm part of that, and that's why I'm fighting. And my dad was just like, huh, you're right. I'm like, yeah. And like I feel like the he's starting to relax his, I guess, perspectives and the stereotype that he's been fed for years. And I see real change, and it's beautiful. And my brother Musie's always talking to my dad, educating him like facts and statistics, because my dad likes that. And I see my dad, I think, changing for the better and wanting to talk. My dad is the one who told me about Ahmad. I didn't even know. He was like, Rita, did you hear? And I was like, no, I haven't. I was avoiding social media. And I loved it that he was like passionate and called me about it, and was like heartbroken. He was heartbroken about it. And my mom was like about to cry. I was like, this is, it's sad to see, but it's good. Because it means like they care. It means they see their son in Ahmad, you know? And that like, I don't want to get much on, but that like really warmed my heart. Because I was like, y'all need to see him like this. Because this is also your problem. Like, you know, it's like the way they neglect African Americans, that like hurts me so much.
Thank you for sharing, Ruta, and
Yeah.
making this personal. It is personal. Um,
It should
and
be personal.
the political is personal. However
Yeah.
much people want to say I'm not political, it's not political. It is political, and the political is personal. And so yeah, I just want to say thank you, and I also want to share my experience in that as well. Very similar, right? Where family members saying, "Oh, like the black people I know, like I've seen are all lazy," right? And I've had experience those, and the immediate reaction is to be really defensive. And I've got myself in that often where I'm like really defensive immediately, and I'm like, "What are you talking about? You're just making that up. Like you know a few people that happen to be black, and your perception of them is being lazy, and now you're making an assumption about a whole group of people who are in the millions." And just think about that, like what are you talking about? Like, what's your evidence? Have you seen studies that show that black people are lazy? Like, show me the numbers. I get really defensive. Like, I'm like shutting them down. It's not a, it's hard sometimes for me to make it a conversation. I think part of it is also, it's funny because I'm able to do that with strangers often.
Mm.
But when it comes to my own family members, I tend to get really like worked up and defensive and like get really at it and attack them and be like, well, you did that. And then they're like, well, now you're making me believe what you believe. I'm like, it's not about believe. This is facts. This is like racism. This is the, and then like, okay, we stop talking. We get all kind of worked up and we stop talking. And I know that's not how I want it to go. But so far, a lot of times, that's how it's gone. Um, and I'm sitting here reflecting on it the last couple of days, weeks, really thinking about how do I make this a conversation. I think looking back, I definitely want to make it a conversation about fact, like history. I think that's going to be really helpful. Like specifically, like around laziness, as like slaves were perceived as lazy. Like slaves who were working nearly 24-hour a day were perceived as lazy. I don't know what your definition of laziness is. That's not laziness. Like they overworked the crap out of them. They took every second of their time they could in order to take advantage of them. So that perception kept being, that stereotype being kept being pushed because slave owners wanted to get as much labor as possible from the enslaved people. And so like, and I think like hoping, framing it that way, like showing some history and saying that also has been perpetuated through American history, like through Jim Crow, through the civil rights movement and fight against the civil rights movement. Opposing movements were trying to push an agenda that basically tried to paint black people into stereotypes, right? So like I think I'm starting to look back at that and think about how I can use history to frame the conversation, hoping that they will see that like they don't want to be part of that. They don't want to be part of the agenda that pushes these stereotypes that continue to put black people down and like cost us our future, cost us our hopes and dreams because people have like perceptions of what we are capable of or not capable of, and how that is also our problem because we're not perceived like you said, Ruta and Adem, I think is like we're not perceived any differently when we're out there and white folks are looking at us. When a cop pulls you over, he's not gonna see Daniel like air
Oh,
training.
you're
It looks like
Richard? Never mind.
yeah,
Thought you
never
were from
mind.
Chicago or something.
I see the flag in the back. Okay, you're good.
Yeah,
That's not
you're
gonna
good.
happen. He's and he's gonna be seen as a black child. And I think like I wonder if that could be like part of the conversation. That's definitely something I'm thinking about.
Oh, if I want to share about my my personal experience, it was not long ago actually. It was in a group of newcomers, like immigrants. We were discussing about some issues in Seattle, and then something came up. Like, I mean, obviously, I admire new immigrants who work hard, who really make it to success. And they were talking about this and say, we're doing this, we're making it to success. How come the Black Americans can't, you know? They were born here, they know the language, they know, they have all these opportunities. How come they can't make it, you know? And then I was a little bit, so my response to that was that, so I told you that I always felt or knew that I did not know enough. So my response to that was, I'm sorry. I mean, you don't know anything. You don't know these people's past. You don't know. Even if you know enough, you will still be not, I mean, you will still not fully understand what they went through. So you are not, you have no the moral, to judge these people. I mean, you need to understand. You should educate yourself. You should learn about their past and their what they went through. So that was my response. I obviously did not know much to share or to educate these people, so I just made it very general.
But you felt it was wrong.
It was no. I said it was wrong. I mean, I
Right.
stated that it was wrong to do that. But I think I wanted to add something to the previous conversation. So when I think about what could be like what is complicating, what is the root cause of these, I don't know, a weird perception about blackness in the Habesha community. I feel like people see blackness as, color. So there is like more black, or then there is less black. So, like they perceive themselves as, so like as a spectrum, like they see blackness as a spectrum. So there are some people are more black than others, So they feel like Habesha people are less black. Whereas it is like you are either black or not. I think it's a category, like it's. But also, I think because people hold this perception of like white superiority, and because they have that internalized, I think everybody wants to make to that status. It's a status, they want to make to that status. So because they feel like they're less black than other people, and they deny like their blackness, so they're trying hard to make to that status, to the whiteness or the status. I think that's what I realized. So I think these are two things that are complicating. I mean, in addition to the stereotypes that is created by the media and other stories, I feel like these are the things that complicate the issue. So what else complicates the the anti-blackness issues in Habesha community? If you
Well,
have
I
more
think something
ideas.
related to that you brought up is a really good point. I mean, there's a book and there's some work by Beverly Tatum who talks about like the mythical norm too. And there is like this thing you're achieving, right? So even in assimilating, or as Black people, American people, all kinds of races, but we're trying to achieve this like fake kind of like level of success or definition of like you've achieved it. And she talks about the norm based on like, right, the 7 isms is like sexism, racism, classism, things like that, is based on what we think is like this perfect model person, right? But if you think about like a successful, perfect, wonderful person, when I teach classes, sometimes I'd have students do this, like close your eyes and think about a successful, person in America. What does that look like? It's usually a white male who's like rich, educated, looks good, like pretty thin, average, able-bodied, right? Like you think of like, what is the depiction of success? Has a briefcase, probably wearing a suit, right? Like these images come to your mind because we've been taught that that's the standard, right? And I think another complication that's similar is like when you immigrate to another country, particularly America, your standard is like white American because, right, I think there's this notion that we associate America with white people, right? Like this is their space. With, like you said earlier, this is stolen land. This is not their space at all. So the real depiction of American should be a Native American, right, and an indigenous person. But when you think about like what is an American, your answer is also this white man, right? And so you're assimilating. Our parents are like, well, these are the most people who are successful, who are educated, who are rich, who have all of these things in our minds, is this white man, right? Or this notion of that. So I think there's not only like all Americans, whether you're an immigrant, recent or not, or whatever, right? There's this level of thinking the standard is, right, this person of success is a white man. But then when you immigrate to America too, there's that expectation because you came here to achieve success, right? And the success is education, money, a house, right? These things that we associate also with white people, because also white people have them more readily and more easily and don't have to work as hard. But like also then there's more of them with that level of success. So there's reasons, right? Systemic and institutionalized oppression and all of that, and that cause that, but there is way more visibly successful white people in America. So then our parents' generation see that, and that's what they're aiming for. That's what they're aiming all their kids to have, right? Hence why most immigrant parents also think there's only 4 degrees in the world that's it. Because, right, we have this depiction of what is success is. You're probably a business person, an engineer, a doctor, a lawyer. I mean, there's like really so much you can do. And so how do we get out of, right, like even the bar is set at this person that looks a certain way, and we're trying to assimilate to that. And then and so then I think in your definition of a spectrum, what I think about is if white is over here, Black is all the way over here at the very end of that, right? And all the other races and ethnicities and people are in the middle. The very end is like Black American, just even on a color spectrum, right? And so in their mind, even as you're saying that spectrum is, you have to get as far as possible as you can from what we would define as unsuccessful or Black, sort of point is like dirty, bad, negative, all the associations, right? Is you need to get as far from that as possible, and it's to be, right? So I think that's a level of complication that is hard for our parents because they did really go through hell and high water for the ones who immigrated here so we could be successful, right? So we didn't go through any of the pains they went through or that Black Americans went through in terms of slavery. Like, right, they're not trying to see us live that life that, people of color, minority, marginalized people are living in America or in other countries back in the day or recent, right? Even if they don't understand the kind of contemporary levels of slavery that people go through right now, they don't want their kids to go through that. And they went through a lot and sacrificed a lot to ensure we didn't get to that point, right? So there's, I think, this other layer of complication that for Eritreans is not only did our parents, our family members go through 30 years of war, right, in back home, then they came here and they're so separated from their culture and their family and their community, and they want to make sure their kids keep some level of instilling their culture, that even when you say things like you're Black, like I know my dad used to say, like, it's disrespectful because in his mind you're negating all of, like you said earlier with that, right, all of who you are that's Eritrean, and that's not what you're doing, but in their mind, because they don't know any different, that's what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
then there's this other layer because of the cultural piece for us and for our parents, I think, where they don't want you to associate in any other way, because for them, then you lose all the culture, all the history. And for a lot of, like, both my parents were in the war, they're Tagalog, so both of them would feel like, what did I sacrifice my whole life and fight in a war and almost die and lose all of these family and friends for you to come here and not be successful, right? So I think this generation that at least has come here a little while ago has an extra complication in when we say things like we're Black, our parents' generation take that a very different way, because I have pictures of my parents like holding guns and being in the war. Like they literally at 15 left so that I didn't do the same thing that they did. So even when we're out there protesting, my dad's like, I left a whole other country and a whole war so you didn't have to be fighting for something like this, right? And you're choosing, in his mind, I'm choosing to engage in that, versus it's not a choice. They're killing people who are me too, but they don't see that exactly the same. But you feel this pressure in a different way as an Eritrean child in America, because I know what my parents went through in a very different kind of fight, right, than some of the Black American peers I have. Doesn't excuse it, but there's some rationale behind it, right?
I agree. Something he said there, Adrian, made me think a little bit about, like, we're having this conversation also not to be pointing fingers, right? We're not pointing fingers at the Habesha community. We're part of it, and we're not like trying to diminish in any way of like our people, or like no one is necessarily directly at fault of any of this. I think part of it is like you said, is like part of the process of coming here has become assimilating to an environment where whiteness is like the standard. And so then, like, when whiteness is the standard, it means that whiteness is also the standard for success. Like, professional success means like you have to assimilate to certain things, right? Like, you have to come be articulate in a certain way. You have to come wearing a suit, and you have to be in an interview, and like certain types of like hair. There's like a lot of pieces of whiteness within like the United States that, like, when you come here and you try to be successful, you have to learn those things, and then in the process of learning them, it becomes part of you, right? Like, and so then you don't realize that that's happening because you haven't been taught about white supremacy culture. You haven't been taught about whiteness. You haven't been taught that, like, that's a thing here. So you come here and you navigate. Really, I'm speaking of my story in some ways, like coming here at the age of 16 and being like, okay, I'm in high school now, and now what does it mean to be in high school in the United States of America, and like having to navigate that and know that I have to pass these standardized tests that are very much dipped in whatever you want to call it, all with whiteness and white supremacy culture. Like, it's definitely prioritizes like whiteness over any other culture. Like, it's not a culturally responsive standardized test. So like you that's your first step, and then after that, to go to college, you got to do X and Y and Z, and like a lot of these pieces continue to be part of me because it feels like I need to change parts of who I am in order to like be successful, but I don't know that that's what I'm doing. And so over time, you go to college and you start to see yourself in some ways where you're like, wait, I'm removing myself further and further from my culture, from even identifying as Black. I'm like learning a whole different thing, and it's becoming part of who I am. And so then it's like, I think Rute said this earlier, it's like you have to unlearn that and like learn something different to replace it with. So this conversation makes me think about that, like, we're saying that we need to unlearn certain things and like and learn new things.
And we've all learned stuff directly or indirectly. Go ahead, Adi.
Well, I was going to say also on top of that, right, I think some of the things like I think about being somebody who, I have a counseling degree, mental health background, is like my parents also have like trauma from war that they don't ever talk about, right? And so there's like living through real life trauma and then migration and right, all of that. And then right, for you, and that's even if you've personally done that yourself, is like then the navigating the system and trying to assimilate in the ways that you need to. So like my parents, they could get away with ultimately not assimilating a lot because they just have to go to work, and so they assimilate there. But when you have to go to school in America, that's a completely different space to have to navigate an assimilation. because you're judged and mistreated and all of that, right? So I don't know. Sometimes I used to talk to my friends like, I don't think you understand the same level of like judgment or trauma and being like an immigrant child in America, not the same as war, but in that trauma and like having to think through that stuff. But I do think about like it's hard for them to talk about these things related to Black Lives Matter or like the deaths and things like that. I think for some of them too, because they're, even if they weren't in the war themselves, they lived in a place of war. Eritrea is not that big, but wherever there was fighting, you probably were amongst it, even if you weren't in it, right? So, so I think for them too, it's like, how are they navigating their own trauma and their own pain and their own issues? Even the next wave of people like my husband, who was, in Sawa for a while too, is, they have their own issues they're not talking about and dealing with. And so like that it isn't their fault, but to try to get them into space to think about how they need to dialogue or think about change. Just like they wanted change for Eritrea, just like they wanted change for, what their kids would have gone through back home, or coming here to provide a space where we had a change. But then in there, not talking about their own trauma, our generation who went through trauma in school, like then you don't talk to your parents about it because they're not talking about their trauma, and you think you just have to do it and survive it or live it or move on or whatever. No one's really working through the talking. And I think that is a space in our community that's complicated, is we don't talk about anything that's bad or like, right, we don't want to talk about those things anyway. And then when we then want to talk about something like, right, people being killed on the streets in the US, which is a free country, it's hard for them to probably engage in that dialogue too, because of the things they've seen and done. And it would make them have to relive some of that stuff and or talk about that stuff for themselves, which is again, not in our skill set as Eritrean people mostly anyway, but would cause so much more pain for them. And so it's like, how do you navigate that dialogue while thinking about what that generation went through too, and in a soft, like nice way. But yeah, I think your point too, and it's not a blaming. There's nothing to blame. Like we all are making mistakes every day, all the time, right? It's just saying yours have a lot more consequence into your thought process about Black people, and then how you might engage, right? If you're not gonna start to have this dialogue at least.
And I think like we've also fallen to victims of, I don't know the word is victims, to be honest, but the whole idea of how back to white supremacy and how they've done a really good job of dividing and conquering until this day. Because I've had a manager, y'all, and I was like, I think 18, and it was like my first like real job. And she was like, oh, I only hire East Africans because they're such a hard workers and just so great and just on time. And it was all these positive attributes, right? She was like, yeah. And it was almost like she's like, I don't hire, like she saw me as Black, but she didn't see me as those Blacks. She saw me as a different Black. And I remember being like, hold up, you have the wrong one. I was like, what? She's like, no, sweetie, it's a compliment. I was like, no, it's not. What? And then I was just so confused. And then I dismissed it, but like, I didn't realize like that, like kind of like messed with my head. Cause it was almost like we as Eritreans or Ethiopians or Somalians, Kenyans, whatever, we're, I guess, docile bodies, because we're immigrants and our parents are like, just listen. Even when I talk back at the airport, like when immigration want to say crazy stuff to me, I'm like, what? No, I have my visa. Da da da. And my mom's like, it's okay. Let her go. It's fine. And I was like, why? Like, why are you harassing me? Like, I was taking my mom to Eritrea, but we were stopping by Dubai for like a few days to just have a vacation before we go to Eritrea, like a relaxed vacation. Because you know how it is for our parents when they go back home. It's like, they're just stressed. So I was like, we're going to kick it here and then we're going to go. My mom didn't want to. And then when we got there, she's like, wow, so glad we did this. I was like, I know. But on our way, we dealt with some crap. And I remember my mom wanted me to be quiet and just say like, I don't know, like, man, like a better word, like house nigga. Just say, yes, you're right, thank you, and just comply. But I was like, no, we did nothing wrong here. What's the issue? She was like, can I ask where you went to school? Da, da, da. And I swear, the more she knew about me, the more the cop lady calmed down. And it was almost like all of a sudden, she was like, okay, you're educated. Oh, you have a really good job. Oh, you do well for yourself. Oh, it was like all of a sudden, like, okay, she's not stereotypical. So let me let it go. And it was this thing we do with, like, in America, I think they divide, like, the immigrants from the Black Americans here. And it happens all the time. And I hate it. And I hate it so much. And my parents almost, not my parents, I guess, the community almost, celebrates it. They're like, oh, yeah, we're not them. We're this, we're that. And I'm just kind of like, damn, like, y'all really let these white people win. Now they got you really thinking that your African American brothers and sisters are not yours. They are the issue. They are the problem. And we are the haves and they're the have-nots, and that is something like I try to point out around our communities and be like, stop, you're not better. You're not a better Black person, you know, just because you're docile bodies. And our poor immigrant parents, I get why they listen and just do what they're supposed to do, just because they're in the mindset of survival, you know? And then, but we're in the mindset of living. So we can question these things, and we have the tools, we have the language, we have the education, and, you know, all these factors that will help us navigate it. And I think we're privileged in that way. We should take advantage of that privilege instead of like grouping ourselves into this like, oh, we're Eritreans. I swear I always say this. Eritreans really be thinking they're, I don't know how to say this, but like how white people be thinking, like really entitled. I'm like, oh, wow. And I asked my sister, is that just me or like Habesha would really be thinking? I've had friends in the club line say, she's like, wait, we're not waiting in line. I'm like, what the hell, girl? Yeah, we are. And she's like, but we're Habesha. She's dead ass. And I was like, make us any different. She's like, no, 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 we're too cute for this. And I know that, and I know they're gonna hate me if they see this, but I know the intention was well, but it was that thing that we have in our head. And I literally said, oh my gosh, we're like white people. We really think we're better. Like, you know what I mean? And it's this sick thing, and I don't know where it comes from, and I want to unlearn it. And I think I have to for the most part, but it's like I want to unlearn it for all of us because it's just it's wild, y'all. Like I don't know, am I the only one? I'm not,
No, not at
am
all.
I
It's so
tripping?
true. No.
I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know. And I haven't been
That's
told
real.
by like my past people I've dated tell me like, Ruta, you operate like a white girl. I'm like, what do you mean? They're like, you demand things, you're entitled, you want things. If a cop wants to talk to us, you're like, what's the reason? They're like you talk with your chest high. And I'm like, what do you mean? And then I got taught like obviously over time, like the reason my African American brothers and sisters can't do that is because of the things they've seen in their households and their families and how cops have treated them in the past. So they just want to, they literally like, bro, like just be quiet, let's just keep walking. And I'm like, why? Why are they following us? We should ask questions. And that's like me being ignorant at the time, you know, because I don't know this. I didn't have this history. I don't see it in my house. I don't have anyone in my family that's been to jail for the wrong, you know, for right or wrong reasons, you know what I mean? And so I never had this. And then I was like, oh my gosh, there's goodness in it, and I'm proud of it because it just made me like be able to speak up. But there's also like the bad side of it too that we have to acknowledge.
I just wanted to say that the issue is there are so many layers to the issue. So obviously we need to continue having a dialogue about those, maybe break all these layers and talk about them like in the future.
Can I add
So
real
go
quick?
ahead.
Bertha said something that reminded me. Another
Yeah.
complication might be fear. Like I think our parents, not just fear for our lives, but the immigration fear, right? Like I think the reason my parents would be like, be quiet, don't say anything is like, because they're like, you're gonna get deported. And I'm like, I don't, that's not real. Like I was like, right. And before, even when I didn't have, if I, you know, we had our citizenship, but we were green card holders. Like, so we were still fine and allowed, but they were still worried, right? And then even when we became citizens, it was still this fear. My dad would be like, they could deport you anytime. And some of it is maybe lack of knowledge of the immigration system or like the U.S. system, but some of it might just be natural fear anyway. Because even when they know it, my dad would still be like, "Oh my God, but they could still send you home whenever they want." And you're like, "Well, I could still get a lawyer, and there's ways that we can work around if they even tried." Because we're citizens, right? So most of us, not all of us, maybe, but most Eritreans who are here, who are citizens at least already, that's the concern isn't the same as a green card holder or if you aren't here with even documents. So, but they think there's a level of like that fear for them also drives some of that either level wanting to assimilate or expectation to kind of be good, right? To like pay attention, don't cause a fuss, like be docile, like you said, Ruta. So I think that immigration fear just always, my dad always brings that up as like a last excuse for me to be quiet. It's like, yeah, you could get deported. I'm like, I have been in the US for over 30 something years. Like, what are you talking about? But he'll still be like stressed about like anything could happen to you. And I'm like, okay. And you know, I'll get a lawyer and call it good. Like, I mean, the stress isn't there the same way for me. Right. They really, that fear really drives them in worrying, right, about getting in trouble. And what obviously like what people think about us is really important in the Eritrean community. So like what will people say if, especially in Guatemala, she cannot go to jail. There's like not allowed, right? But then even on top of that, what will happen to you if you went and got deported? And so that fear, I think about like that fear really drives them a lot too.
Yes, thank you for making that clear, my point.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree anymore with that. The question that comes to mind at this point in this conversation is like, what action steps can we take as a collective, like as a Habesha community, and then what action steps can individuals start to take to unlearn and learn to be part of the movement, so that ultimately the goal is liberation, right? Liberation of black bodies in America, and we are black bodies, so long as we are living here in the United States of America. And I know it's a load of questions, so feel free to unpack it.
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, this is a great start of like, I think communication. I think that's the first part of like, right, we have to get people in a room or remote videos or however we can try to start dialogues with people in our communities about all of these things, right, and more. But I think the first step is like people need to commit to like talking about things and things that are hard and uncomfortable and like awkward. And, you know, I think I recognize this in most people of color and immigrant communities. Like we don't like to air our dirty laundry, but like it's gonna have to require us to tell some things about ourselves and about each other and talk about, right, the way we are and why we are and things like that. And I know obviously like the younger generation is a little bit more comfortable with that sometimes, but how do we get everybody in the room, multi-generation, right, generational, in talking? Just, I think first and foremost, we have to talk. We can't get people to talk, we're gonna have a really hard time to make a lot of movement.
Just like, yeah, what she said, first talk about it, create an awareness. Like, you know how they say in therapy, the first step is to admit there's a problem. Because a lot of people, I think, really struggle to have a problem. And I know I shouldn't say the word racist. I was just wilding because I was in my feelings. But I was like, you all are racist. You're racist. You're racist. I really went crazy. And then I went on a walk. Like, that's not helpful. That didn't help nobody. They just looked at me crazy. And I looked crazy. So I guess in a way to acknowledge our own mistakes and forgive ourselves honestly for the things we have been taught when we don't know better, and know that this is like a whole system that we don't even see coming. Like you said, Jonas, it was like indirectly you were absorbing these things and, you know, creating this identity for yourself without, just to be successful or to survive. And so like communicate, talk about it, admit that we do have a problem within our community. Because the fact that like my homegirl tried to call me, I said, hey, I can't talk, I have a little, I think I have a thing to do. She's like, oh, what do you got to do? And I said, oh, this like anti-blackness. We were trying within her. She's like, anti-blackness? Just that word was like so triggering. So anyway, so yeah, like I think communicate, talk, admit that we do have a problem, and then get into the and be okay with it and not to shame ourselves. I think is another one. You know, it's not something to be shameful for at all. Like we all are, I think, in different phases of learning. Some know a lot. Like just from this conversation, I learned so much, honestly. And I know we will continue. And then actionable items, I think, come after that. But those are like the, I think, main thing that needs to happen is my part.
And I think in that talking is education. Like, how do we bring people who can share the history? Because I mean, my dad loves history. He's a historian, so I know for a long time, like he knew a lot about the slavery kind of movement, not as much about the civil rights movement because he was going through his own struggles and fights, right? But but like would try to learn from a just basic historical standpoint, not the impact on like Black people later, but just like this thing happened in history. So I think there's some training that we do need to do for our community about like what actually happened, right? Like these moments, but also in some of the like systemic oppression, institutionalized racism. I mean, right, we really got to break down racism for them. So that they can see then where that manifests in healthcare, in education, right, in all of these places, and your own personal internalization of all of those things, and how you explain that. And I think about some of the older generation in Tigrinya. I have no idea. So like, we need some good translators, and I'm looking at you, Carlo, right there. People who can help, right? And because I can try to explain it to my dad in English, but there's some things that just don't translate the same way. And so I think for some of those generations, they need to have a understanding. And some of that is, it might not exist in Eritrean language anyway, some of those words. And so how do we help them understand what it means? And so I think there's a level then of education. And, you know, I saw my dad, when my friends would come over who weren't Eritrean, he'd be like, let me tell you about the Eritrean history. And he wanted to tell like all the war, all the struggle, right? He'll like go through all of the things. I'm like, in the same way, Dad, you need to learn Black history in America, right? Like there's a difference of like in Africa and all of the different countries within Africa, what they have gone through. And then in America and in other countries, Brazil, right? Like, so I think being able to help them understand like the history, the stories, the moments, but also then how that impacts them now in terms of like institutional and systemic oppression, right? And I think if they can understand that, that's like a good step in like how can we move forward as a community to like being more inclusive, like, you know, being more thoughtful. And I think some of, like, I talked to some parents, you know, when their kids want to go to college about even understanding the kids growing up in America, that dual identity they have to have anyway, because they like want their kids to like, you know, like tell my kid not to leave home. I'm like, I'm not going to tell your kid not to leave home. Like they're going to go to college and like they want to live on campus. Let's talk about that. And they, you know, parents have a hard time. Adam, I asked you to talk to them because you're going to tell them to stay home. I'm like, no, like you need to understand both sides of that, right? And so the same thing for our parents, like how do you understand then both sides of what's happening, and then how do we move forward, and like, you know, that your children, like I tell my dad, like you're worried about the fact that we're becoming Americanized. You brought me to America. What else did you think was going to happen? Like in what world would I not become somewhat American? Maybe not fully, right? And so I think in the same way, like how would you not expect your children's identity to encompass Black identity in America? We live every day as Black people. When we go to school and like in our communities and our jobs, we're seen by other people as, you know, Black. So we have to navigate that identity for ourselves. And we all have a different formation of our identity, and it develops and changes all the time. But we have to navigate that, and we can't go to you for help, because my dad is not navigating being Black in America. That he's Eritrean, true and true, and that's it, right? So I can't even ask you for help in the same way. And so I think for them to understand, just as some of you are struggling with your kids being like American, they are navigating their sense of identity of being Black or Eritrean or white or whatever they're thinking they are. They're going through that struggle, and how do you help your children through that space? In the same way, then we have to talk about how you help think about for yourself, what does that mean then to tell your kid they're not Black? Like that's hurtful, right? That's causing a lot of problems. So I think there's ways in educating that we can also tie to just like their children, right? That would be helpful understanding.
Both people need to learn and also engage with each other in dialogue, and which means I think to some extent we have to create spaces like this one and bigger ones for people to opt in, right? To opt in, listen, learn, pay attention, and be exposed to some new information. And I think that's like it's almost like a campaign, right? Like there needs to be sort of a campaign to like create awareness to do this work. And I think also at the individual level, right, of like individual reflections that need to be had, both even the people who grew up here, right, in ways in which they perpetuate anti-blackness and racism, but also in ways in which they're complicit in it, right? Like there were times I was complicit. I didn't say anything. Or I said, oh no, like what are you talking about? Like white people are worst. Like instead of like attacking directly what they're saying and like really actually like questioning and pushing back and engaging in dialogue about what they said, I co-opted it to saying like, no, what do you mean? Like white people are worse. No, 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 no. Which wasn't really helpful, right? And so like I think that complicity is there, and like even with the younger folks who are born here, sometimes they're nervous, like they don't know how to engage in the conversation with their family members, and so they like just kind of retreat, nod their head or smile, walk away from the conversation, right? And so now is not the time to continue to do that. I think it's time to like start to be like, okay, how do I do this? And then how can I go in prepared to have this conversation? And when it does come up, like how can I engage in a conversation with my family members in a way that's not gonna end up in me having to walk away like what I had to do. You know, because you're so worked up that you're like, you know,
Right.
passion and your anger shows up, and then you can't even like
Lose
they can't even learn,
focus.
they can't even learn anything from that, right? It's because they just
Right.
like, what's wrong with her, and it becomes about you.
Literally, I look
Yeah.
crazy. Like, Dande? They
Yeah.
literally try to assume what happened to me. Like, literally, all the too much to do. Did she work? What happened? I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm fine. You guys happened.
Exactly. Exactly. I like that. Yeah. So that's
Wow.
kind of where I'm at. Yeah.
I was gonna say, I think the other thing too is when I know sometimes when I talk to people and I'll say like, oh, we should talk about this Black Lives Matter movement or like Black people, right? They're instantly like, oh, you want to go protest and like break things and like be out there and like being destructive, right? And I'm like, no, like I just want to talk about, and so I think it's helping them understand the level, to your point about like even when it's internal, it's we all have it, we all need to deal with it, we all need to work on it, but us engaging in the dialogue doesn't mean I want you to go like protest and write a letter and like try to like break the system, right? I do want you to do that eventually, but like there's not, we don't have to go straight from 0 to 100, right? That like
Right.
even just having that, but I think sometimes our parents associate with like when you bring that up, you're instantly trying to get them to like sign a petition, go somewhere, give some money, right? Like it's not like, no, can we just like one Saturday night, like we can have fun and like just talk, you know what I mean? Like, and so
Right.
find ways that you already engage with your family, like whether it's coffee time or tea or going to Starbucks or like right dinner or whatever, to just like start the dialogue. And even really simply like, you know, have you been watching the stuff with the protests? Like, what do you think? What do you think's going on, right? And it to be a really simple question, and then you start to go from there of like having a discussion, and then monitoring. I think with something like you got to monitor your own emotions and feelings too, right? And then be like, oh, this is getting too emotional for me. I got to check myself and know when you need to step out. But if you just ask like one little question, you know, our parents could talk, like they'll just talk about all kinds of stuff, and so it'll get to,
Mm-hmm.
but you could just ask one little question, right? It's not like you'd be like, let's tackle anti-blackness without Eritrean community, mom. But it's just like, hey, mom, like, are you seeing the protests? Like, what are you thinking? You know, both my little sisters are really engaged in the Black Lives Matter movement in Phoenix. So I'm like, hey, mom, like, what do you think about your kids being in that, right? Just even like a simple question to start that dialogue, and then you go from there. So but I think it's you get afraid to ask because you know our parents are going to think, oh, you're instantly trying to be all out there with those people and doing these things, and they're worried about your safety, and they're worried about, you know, you getting arrested or all these things. And so how do you just like start small?
Good idea.
Good. So I don't have much to add. There is a lot of things to unlearn and unlearn new things. But I wanted to ask you quickly one last question. How would you respond to someone who says, "This is not my fight"?
Good question.
I mean, I think about like what we talked about earlier. Part of me is like, well, you're here, right? Like you are impacted because you're part of the system because you live in America now. You know, even if you're like, you know, like the old school Habesha parents, will always be like, well, I'm going to go back home one day. Like, you know, I'm like, that's cool. Until that day happens, you're a part of this though, right? And you are impacted just as much. And so, but for me, I think about like how do I relate it to something that makes sense to them? So like for my dad, I would say like, oh, you're at work and like imagine that somebody else got a raise and you've been, you know, he's been working there for like 30 years, you know, for no other reason. You do way better work or whatever. And then, you know, like what if that person was any other race or like white and they find out you're the only Black person there or the only African, whatever you want to call yourself. That's there and you didn't get the raise or you didn't get the promotion and you know it's, or you get fired and it's discriminatory, you know, like right, like you're impacted by how these other people might treat you even if you don't see yourself that way. And then I think the other part for if they have kids here is this, you know, conversation we've been having earlier is like this is impacting your kids whether you like it or want to admit it or not, right? And even if your kids are not telling you, they are impacted by that. And so then how do you, you know, the relatability. So like even if it's not your physical fight right now, it impacts your family, it impacts yourself, it impacts your income, like your taxes are going to these people, right? Like it's still part of this process that you are a part of by living here, whether that's 5 years or like, you know, 50 years, like you still are part of the system. And you can also have the energy to focus on things in IRCA and things here and like make sure that the home you live in right now and your kids live in and your family lives in or you live in, you're protected and taken care of the same way you would back home if that was it. So I mean, I think that's how I would talk to people who would say like this isn't their fight, right? I think there is a space, like I said earlier, of like the prioritization of needs. So like if they're an immigrant who just recently got here, they have different needs than caring about this fight because they're worried about getting their documentation or getting a job or getting school, getting housing. So it's okay that you have needs physically, right? Like that you need to meet that might take priority in terms of the things that you have to do right now. But that doesn't mean you still can't learn, have the conversation, right? So that later you can be educated enough to make sure, to Yanas's point, you don't perpetrate, right, this issue just because you don't know better. That's not going to be an excuse. So I think there's a difference again in like, it's your fight in like learning versus your fight in doing. I'm not telling you to do anything yet. I'm telling you to learn so that if you have the space to do later, you know what to do and like what's necessary. But you live here. I mean, like right out, so that's like my husband, all his friends, all these people that are recent immigrants, even if they're younger. I'm like, but you live here now. Like, right, you can take care of both places and be a part of both causes.
No additional thoughts. I think you nailed it, and I hope that those people will see some of the things we've been talking about, and if they capture any of that, I think they'll understand why this is their fight as well.
Inshallah.
All right.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Al. Appreciate
Thank
you
you.
for coming through and like getting this conversation started. Uh, and really, hope is that we'll share this with the world, and people will watch and comment and hopefully engage and learn from it.
All right, thank you guys.
Thanks,
It
everyone.
was a good session.
Thanks,
Can't wait
everyone.
for the
Have a
next
great
one.
day.
All right, yeah, we'll reach out for the next one. Hopefully,
Yeah.
we'll have maybe hopefully our next step is to invite a larger group and have like breakout groups and such. But
Yeah.
we'll stay in touch with you.
Okay. Sounds good. Just let us know how we can support in that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
Okay.
Thanks.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Thanks.
Have a
Ciao,
good
Watch.
night.
Everyone.
Have a good
All right.
one.